Australia's Constitutional Inheritance. Lecture 1. The Long Inheritance. From Runnymede to Federation. You know the story. Every schoolchild knows the story. A meadow beside the Thames. June in 1215. Armoured barons surround a cornered king. They present him with a document, a charter of liberty. The king, furious but helpless, sets his seal to the parchment. Liberty is won, Magna Carta is born, and from that founding moment flows everything that follows: Parliament, the common law, the rights of Englishmen, and ultimately the constitutional inheritance that Australia received on the 1st of January 1901. It is a magnificent story. It has been told for 800 years. It appears in textbooks, in political speeches, in the reverent tones of lawyers and constitutionalists who make pilgrimage to Runnymede to stand where freedom was born. There is only one problem. The story is a myth, not a lie. The events at Runnymede happened. But the meaning we have attached to those events, the narrative of the founding moment when liberty was won, that is a myth. And, like most myths, it obscures a more interesting truth. The document sealed at Runnymede on the 15th of June 1215 was not a triumph. It was a failure. It did not establish liberty. It produced civil war. It lasted 10 weeks before it was annulled. And the annulment was not some act of royal treachery. It was legally sound, canonically proper, and entirely predictable to anyone who understood the constitutional position of England in 1215. The real Magna Carta, the one that actually became part of English law, the one that was cited for centuries as the foundation of English liberty, emerged not from that dramatic confrontation, but from something far less glamorous. A decade of negotiation, reissue, and gradual acceptance. Not a founding moment, but an iterative process. Not revolution, but evolution. This distinction matters. It matters because it reveals something fundamental about how liberty actually develops, not through dramatic breaks with the past, but through the slow accumulation of precedent and practice. It matters because it is the difference between Rousseau and Burke, between designed constitutions and grown ones, between the French Revolution and the English settlement. And it matters because Australia inherited not the myth, but the reality, an evolved constitution, not a designed one. Let me tell you what actually happened. A cornered king. King John was not a good king. His contemporaries called him Lackland and Softsword, the prince without an inheritance, the warrior without victories. He had lost Normandy to the French. He had quarrelled disastrously with Pope Innocent III, resulting in England being placed under interdict for 6 years. No masses, no marriages, no Christian burials. He had been excommunicated. He had taxed his barons relentlessly to fund military failures. By 1213, John was desperate. Philip Augustus of France was preparing to invade. The Pope had declared John deposed and authorized Philip to take the English throne. John needed the Pope's support, and he needed it immediately. What he did next was extraordinary. In May 1213 at Ewell, outside Dover, John surrendered his kingdom to Pope Innocent III. He gave England and Ireland to the papacy, receiving them back as a papal fief. He became the Pope's vassal, owing feudal homage and an annual tribute of 1,000 marks. England was now legally a possession of the Holy See. This was humiliating, but it worked. Innocent lifted the interdict and the excommunication. He withdrew his support from Philip. John was secure from foreign invasion, at least, but his barons had had enough. They had watched John lose their Norman lands. They had paid his taxes and received nothing in return. They had seen him grovel before the Pope. In 1214, when John's continental campaign ended in a catastrophic defeat at Bouvines, the barons began to organize. By early 1215, England was sliding towards civil war. The rebel barons gathered at Northampton, renounced their feudal allegiance, and marched on London. The capital opened its gates to them. John, outmaneuvered, agreed to negotiate. The Meadow. Runnymede was neutral ground, a water meadow between Windsor, where John was based, and Staines, where the barons had camped. Negotiations began around the 10th of June. By the 15th, a document had been agreed. John set his seal to it. This is the scene everyone remembers. But look at who was present. The document's preamble lists those at whose advice the king acted. Among them, Master Pandulph, subdeacon and member of the papal household. Pandulph was the Pope's man in England, not a full legate, but a representative of the Holy See. He witnessed the charter. His seal, along with those of the Archbishop of Canterbury and other bishops, was to guarantee its terms. And what were those terms? 63 clauses, most of them addressing the specific grievances of 13th century barons' limits on feudal dues, rules about wardship and inheritance, regulations on royal forests, but also, embedded among the particulars, some general principles. Clause 39, no free man shall be seized, imprisoned, dispossessed, outlawed, exiled, or ruined in any way, nor in any way proceeded against, except by the lawful judgment of his peers and by the law of the land. Clause 4.2, to no one will we sell, to no one will we deny or delay right or justice. These clauses would echo through centuries, but in June 1215 they were part of a document that was legally doomed from the moment it was sealed. Great Charter's annulment. Why was the 1215 charter illegitimate? 3 reasons, each sufficient on its own. First, it was obtained under duress. The barons had raised an army, they had seized London, they had renounced their allegiance, and made war on their king. John sealed the charter with a sword at his throat. In both common law and canon law, agreements extracted by force are void. You cannot hold a man at knife point, and then enforce the contract he signs. Second, England was a papal fief. John had surrendered his kingdom to Innocent III 2 years earlier. He held England as the Pope's vassal. Any major constitutional change required papal consent. The barons at Runnymede knew this. That is why they demanded that the Archbishop and Pandulph guarantee the charter, and that John promised not to seek papal annulment. But a promise extracted by force is no more valid than any other agreement extracted by force. Third, the charter violated the Pope's rights as feudal overlord. Innocent III was not merely the spiritual head of Christendom. He was, in law, the lord of whom John held England. The barons were his tenants-in-chief once removed. By forcing changes to the terms on which John held his fief, they were interfering with Innocent's feudal rights he had not consented to alter. When news of Runnymede reached Rome, Innocent acted swiftly. On the 24th of August, 1215, 10 weeks after the sealing, he issued a papal bull annulling the charter. His language was scathing. The document was illegal and unjust, he declared, shameful and demeaning to the king, damaging to the rights of the Holy See, and extracted by violence and fear. He released John from his oath to observe it. He forbade the barons to enforce it. He threatened excommunication for anyone who persisted. This was not John manipulating a compliant pope. This was the Pope exercising his legitimate authority over a fief he lawfully held. Innocent had proper canonical grounds for everything he did. The barons had overreached, and they were about to discover the consequences. The Civil War. With the charter annulled, civil war erupted. The barons, desperate, invited Prince Louis of France to take the English throne. French troops landed. The country descended into chaos. John marched north, then south, then north again, trying to suppress rebellion on multiple fronts. October 1216, crossing the Wash, a treacherous tidal estuary in East Anglia, his baggage train was caught by the incoming tide. Wagons, horses, supplies, and treasure were swallowed by the quicksand and the rising waters. According to some accounts, the crown jewels themselves were lost, though what exactly disappeared has been disputed ever since. Days later, John was dead. The traditional story blames peaches and cider consumed to excess, followed by dysentery. Whatever the cause, he died at Newark on the 18th of October, 1216, leaving a 9-year-old son to inherit a kingdom at war. Half of it occupied by French troops, the Great Charter annulled, and the whole constitutional settlement in ruins. So much for the founding moment. The real Magna Carta. Here is where the real story begins, and here is where Burke's wisdom becomes visible. John's son was crowned Henry III at Gloucester on the 28th of October, 1216. The ceremony was hasty and improvised. The boy was crowned with a simple golden circlet, because the proper regalia may have been lost in the wash. The papal legate, Cardinal Guala, presided. William Marshal, the great knight who had served 4 kings, became regent. Marshal faced a crisis. French troops held London. Half the barons were in rebellion. The new king was a child. How could the royalist cause survive? Marshal's answer was brilliant. Within weeks of the coronation, he reissued Magna Carta, not the same charter. The more objectionable clauses were removed, particularly the security clause that had given the barons power to make war on the king. But the core principles remained. The king would rule under law, justice would not be sowed or denied, no free man would be imprisoned except by lawful judgment. The charter was issued in the names of the young king and the cardinal legate with their seals attached. This changed everything. The rebels had justified their cause by claiming to defend the charter. Now the royalists had embraced the charter too. The issue was no longer charter versus king, but which side better represented the settlement. Marshal was offering the rebels a way back. Submit to Henry, and you will have your liberties. It worked. The rebellion began to crumble. The French withdrew. By 1217, the war was over, and Magna Carta was reissued again, with further modifications. But these were still expedient measures taken by a regency for a child king. They could be repudiated when Henry came of age. The true test came in 1225. The voluntary charter. Henry III was now 18. He needed money. Kings always need money, and he summoned a great council to request a tax. The barons were willing to pay, but they had a price, another confirmation of the charter, not extracted by force, not issued in emergency, but given freely by an adult king in exchange for a grant of taxation. Henry agreed. The 1225 Magna Carta was issued in the king's own name, of his spontaneous and free will, in exchange for 1/15 of all movable property. It was enrolled on the official records. It bore the king's seal. This was the document that mattered. This was the Magna Carta that became law, not the failed revolutionary document of 1215, but the negotiated settlement of 1225, confirmed by Edward I in 1297 and entered into the statute rolls. You see what happened. The myth says liberty was won at Runnymede in a dramatic confrontation. The reality is that the Runnymede Charter failed utterly, annulled within weeks, productive only of civil war. What succeeded was different. A voluntary grant, repeatedly confirmed, gradually embedded in the practices and expectations of the realm. Not a founding moment, but an iterative process. Not a clean break with the past, but a negotiated evolution. This is how constitutional liberty actually develops. Not in single dramatic acts, but through repeated accommodations, gradual adjustments, the slow accumulation of precedent and practice. The myth of Runnymede is Rousseau, the social contract, the founding moment, the decisive break. The reality of Magna Carta is Burke. Inherited wisdom, evolved institutions, the partnership of the dead, the living, and the unborn. We shall see this pattern again and again. The moments remembered as revolutionary turning points were really moments of consolidation, when practices that had developed over time were formally recognized. The real work happened before and after in the unglamorous business of institutional evolution. The clauses that endured. What did the Charter actually establish? Most of its clauses dealt with 13th century particulars now obsolete. But clauses 39 and 40, or their equivalents, in the 1225 version, reached beyond their immediate context. No free man shall be seized or imprisoned or dispossessed or outlawed or exiled or in any way ruined. Nor will we go or send against him except by the lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land. To no one will we sell, to no one will we deny or delay right or justice. These were not grants of specific rights, but statements of principle. King could not simply seize you because he wanted to. There must be lawful judgment, lawful process. Justice was not a favor the crown dispensed at pleasure. It was something you were owed. In 1215, free men meant something narrower than it does today, not serfs, not villains, but the barons and knights and freeholders who made up the political class. But the language was broader than the immediate purpose. Over centuries, the category expanded. The principles that protected barons came to protect everyone. This is the genius of the common law. It works by precedent, by analogy, by extension. A rule created for one situation is applied to another. Rights developed for the powerful gradually extend to the weak. The law grows, adapts, evolves, not by deliberate design, but through the accumulated decisions of judges facing particular cases. Lord Camden, in 1765, cited Magna Carta when striking down the government as claim to search private homes without warrant. John Entick, a pamphleteer, had his house ransacked by the king's messengers. He sued. The government argued that a warrant from the Secretary of State authorized the search. Camden was unimpressed. "If it is law," he declared, "it will be found in our books. If it is not to be found there, it is not law. The government had no legal authority for what it had done." Entick won damages, and a principle that began with barons resisting King John became a protection for every Englishman against arbitrary search and seizure. The birth of Parliament. 50 years after Runnymede, another step was taken. Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester, had led a baronial revolt against Henry III, the same Henry who confirmed Magna Carta in 1225, now an old man. De Montfort had won a civil war and captured the king. He ruled England, but he needed legitimacy, support, money. In January 1265, de Montfort summoned a parliament. This was not unusual. Kings had been summoning councils of magnates for generations. What was unusual was who he invited, and not just the great lords, not just the bishop. For the first time, representatives of the commons, 2 knights from each shire, 2 burgesses from each town. De Montfort was no democrat. He summoned the commons because he needed them, their money, and their soldiers. It was a tactical move in a civil war. Within months, de Montfort was dead, killed at the Battle of Evesham, his body mutilated by royalist troops. Yet the precedent survived the man. When future kings needed to raise taxes beyond their ordinary revenues, they found it useful to summon not just the lords, but representatives of those who would pay. The commons came to Parliament because the kings needed their consent. By the 14th century, this occasional practice had hardened into constitutional principle. Parliament was now two houses, Lords and Commons. The Commons had established its control over taxation. No new tax without the Commons' consent. The formula for legislation became fixed. Laws were made by the king with the advice and consent of the lords spiritual and temporal, and of the commons in Parliament assembled. King in Parliament, not the king alone, not Parliament alone. The three elements together, each checking the others. A Stuart tragedy. Let me take you to a January morning in 1649. A scaffold has been erected outside the banqueting house in Whitehall. The building is magnificent. Inigo Jones's masterpiece, its ceiling painted by Rubens, with scenes of King James I ascending to heaven. Through those doors now walks James's son, King Charles I, to his execution. Charles wears two shirts. He has asked for them particularly. It is a cold day, and he does not want to shiver on the scaffold. The crowd might think he was afraid. He speaks briefly. He forgives his enemies. He affirms that he dies, a Christian according to the profession of the Church of England. He lies down, places his head on the block, stretches out his arms as the signal, and the axe falls. A groan rises from the crowd. A sound, one witness said, as I never heard before and desire I may never hear again. How did it come to this? How did England, the England of Magna Carta, of Parliament, of the common law, end up executing its own king? The story is too long to tell in full, but the essence is this. Stuart kings, James I and his son Charles I, believed in the divine right of king. They chafed at parliamentary constraints. Charles tried to rule without Parliament for 11 years, raising money through dubious expedients, governing through prerogative courts that bypassed the common law. When he finally needed Parliament to fund a war against Scottish rebels, Parliament was not in a forgiving mood. They would not grant money until their grievances were addressed. Charles would not yield. Parliament would not yield. Civil war began in 1642. Parliament won. Charles was captured. And then a revolutionary logic took hold. A court was created without legal authority to try the king for treason. Charles was convicted and executed. The monarchy was abolished. England became a republic, the Commonwealth. The Cromwellian lesson. And now the English discovered what a republic meant. Oliver Cromwell, the military leader who had won the war, became Lord Protector, a king in all but name, ruling through the army, more absolute than Charles had ever been. Parliaments were summoned and dissolved when they proved uncooperative. Constitutions were written and abandoned. Let me give you a scene. It is April 1653. The Rum Parliament, what remains of the Long Parliament after various purges, is sitting at Westminster. Cromwell arrives with a file of musketeers. He takes his seat, listens to the debate, then rises. "I will put an end to your prating," he says. "You are no Parliament," he calls in the soldiers. "Take away that fool's bauble," he says, pointing to the ceremonial mace, the symbol of parliamentary authority. The members are driven out at bayonet point. Cromwell locks the door and pockets the key. This was the revolution for parliamentary liberty. The Commonwealth became the Protectorate. The Protectorate was a military dictatorship disguised by constitutional forms. When Cromwell died in 1658, his son Richard succeeded him. Just as if the Protectorate were a hereditary monarchy, Richard lacked lacked his father's ability. Within months, the regime was collapsing, and in 1660 the English did something remarkable. They invited the son of the king they had executed to return from exile and reclaim his throne. The Restoration was not simply a return to the old order. It was an acknowledgment that the experiment had failed. England had tried to remake its constitution according to principle, to design a new system from first principles. The result had been civil war, regicide, military dictatorship, and chaos. Burke would articulate the lesson a century later, but the English who welcomed Charles II home in 1660 already knew it in their bones. Grown institutions, for all their imperfections, are more reliable than designed ones. The glorious settlement. Unfortunately, the Stuarts were slow learners. Charles II understood that he owed his throne to Parliament. His brother James, who succeeded him in 1685, had learned nothing. James II was openly Catholic. He claimed powers Parliament had denied. He alienated almost everyone. By 1688, even James' supporters had had enough. Protestant nobles invited William of Orange, who was married to James's Protestant daughter Mary, to invade. William landed in November. James's support evaporated. His own daughter Anne deserted him. His best general went over to William. James fled for France. On his way he threw the Great Seal of the realm into the Thames, as if disposing of the symbol could prevent the transfer of power. But he was caught by fishermen in Kent, and brought back to London. William, having no desire to make James a martyr, let him escape again. This time he made it to France. Parliament declared that James had abdicated. William and Mary were offered the throne, but only after they accepted a Declaration of Rights setting out what the Crown could not do. The Bill of Rights of 1689 declared illegal the powers James had claimed. The coronation oath required the new monarchs to govern according to the statutes in Parliament agreed on, and the laws and customs of the same. This was a glorious revolution, glorious because it was almost bloodless, because it achieved by settlement what the Civil War had failed to achieve by violence. The king would henceforth reign under law. Ministers would be accountable to Parliament. Judges would be independent. The Constitution would be balanced. Notice what the revolutionaries of 1688 did not do. They did not write a new constitution. They did not start from first principles. They did not declare the rights of man. They declared what the law already was, and bound the new monarchs to observe it. They reformed by restoration, claiming to return to ancient liberties rather than to invent new ones. This was the inheritance that would cross the oceans to Australia. The colonial inheritance. When the British established colonies in Australia, they brought this inheritance with them. The early settlement was not pretty. New South Wales was a penal colony, governed by military officers, then by governors with autocratic powers. But the inheritance was always there, waiting. The court supplied English common law. As the free population grew, so did demands for the institutions that free Englishmen expected. In 1823, New South Wales received a legislative council. In 1842, it was partly elected. By 1856, New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, and Tasmania all had responsible government, elected parliaments, ministries responsible to those parliaments, governors who acted on ministerial advice. The colonists had not had to fight for this. They had not had to rebel, or write revolutionary declarations, or invent new constitutional theories. They received as their birthright the institutions their ancestors had developed over centuries. Federation. By the 1880s, 6 self-governing colonies existed on the Australian continent. The Federation movement sought to unite them not by overthrowing the existing order, but by building upon it. The colonists did not want to cease being British. They wanted to be both British and Australian. The Constitutional Conventions of 1891 and 1897 to 98 drafted a constitution that balanced the interests of large colonies and small, of free traders and protectionists. And then they did something unprecedented. They submitted it to referendums in each colony. The people consented. On the 1st of January 1901, the Commonwealth of Australia came into existence. What the founders created. What did the founders create? A federal system dividing powers between Commonwealth and states, a parliament of two houses, representatives and Senate, an executive drawn from Parliament and responsible to it, a high court to interpret the Constitution, an amendment process requiring popular approval, and what the founders did not create is equally significant. They did not create a Bill of Rights. They trusted the common law inheritance, the structure of responsible government, the courts applying ancient principles. They believed that liberty was better protected by institutions than by declaration. Were they right? That is a question for later lectures. But their choice was conscious and considered. What we received. So what did Australians receive on the 1st of January 1901? Not just a document, a civilization. We received the Crown, the apex of the constitutional structure, the source of executive authority, the symbol of continuity. We received responsible government, ministers accountable to Parliament, Parliament accountable to the people. We received the common law, 8 centuries of precedent and principle adapted to Australian conditions. We received federalism, power divided between levels of government. We received an independent Jude. We received the rule of law, the principle that government itself is bound by law. These are not abstractions. They are institutional realities developed over centuries, tested by civil war and revolution and restoration. They were not designed by any single mind. They evolved. Magna Carta did not create this inheritance. The failed Charter of 1215 created nothing but civil war. What created the inheritance was the long process that followed. The reissues of 1216 and 1217, the voluntary grant of 1225, the confirmation of 1297, and the centuries of development that built upon these foundations. The myth says liberty was won in a founding moment. The reality is that liberty was grown over generations. The myth is Rousseau, the reality is Burke, and Australia inherited the reality, not a designed constitution, but an evolved one, not a revolutionary settlement, but the latest expression of an 800-year tradition. The inheritance is real. The inheritance is precious. And the inheritance, if we are careless or ignorant, can be lost. In the next lecture we shall examine how the Australian constitutional system is supposed to work, the role of the Governor-General, the reserve powers, the conventions that make the system function. We shall see what happens when the brake is applied and what happens when the brake is removed. End of Lecture 1.